Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 28th of November 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular article appears on page number 11. The title of the article is Gubernatorial Restructuring. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS paper 2 under the subsection Appointment to various constitutional posts, powers, functions and responsibilities of various constitutional bodies. As you all must be aware, Article 163 of the Indian Constitution provides that the office of governor would be required to act upon the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Chief Minister. However, at the same time, Article 163 also provide for certain exceptions wherein the office of governor can also exercise certain discretionary powers. Now, as to what exactly these discretionary powers could be. Now, for instance, after the assembly elections, if no single party wins the required majority to form the government, then the governor can exercise his discretionary powers to call a certain party to form the government. Now, such exercise of discretionary powers for the governor have proved to be extremely controversial on account of number of reasons. Now, as seen after the recent assembly elections in both Maharashtra as well as Karnataka, some of the decisions taken by the governors have proved to be extremely controversial. Now, for instance, in case of Maharashtra, the swearing-in ceremony of Devendra Fadnavis and Ajit Pawar took place without any kind of public notice. Similarly, in case of Manipur, after the assembly elections that were held recently, the Indian National Congress had won around 28 seats. However, the BJP had won around 21 seats. Now, in spite of the fact that the Indian National Congress was the single largest party, the governor in case of Manipur actually invited the BJP party to form the government. The same thing happened even in case of Goa as well. So some of the decisions taken by the governors in the recent past have proved to be extremely controversial, and hence reasonable apprehension has been raised that the office of governor is open to be manipulated and misused for certain political purposes. Such apprehensions have in turn raised concerns that the independence and autonomy of the office of governor may have been compromised. Now, whenever the governors have taken certain controversial decisions, it is the Supreme Court of India that has intervened in order to prevent the political bias of the governors. However, this particular article highlights that such form of intervention by the Supreme Court at regular intervals may not be sufficient enough to ensure the independence and autonomy of the office of governor. Going forward, there is a need to bring about radical reforms with respect to the appointment and tenure of the governors. In our DNS dated 11th of April 2019, we have discussed in detail as to what reforms have to be brought in with respect to the appointment and the tenure of the office of governor. And the title of this particular article, as you can see here, is Gubernatorial Impropriety, which is almost similar to the article in the today's newspaper, which is titled as the Gubernatorial Restructuring. Hence, what I would do here is that I would attach the previous DNS video for your revision. So please go through this previous DNS and also please try to attempt the mains question for the practice which has been given at the end of this particular discussion. The governor of a state occupies a very important constitutional post in India. The governor forms a vital link between the center and the state, wherein he represents the center at the state level and he represents the state at the central level. Now, because of the importance attached to the office of governor, the governor is required to act in an impartial, neutral as well as unbiased manner, and he has to promote the spirit of cooperative federalism. That means to say, he has to ensure that there is a proper coordination between the center and states. And this is extremely important in a country like India because India is facing multiple problems such as poverty, issues related to security and terrorism, climate change, etc. And we cannot solve these multiple problems unless there is effective coordination between the center and states. And such an effective coordination can be brought about through the office of governor. However, what has happened in the recent times is that the office of governor has turned controversial, wherein some of the governors have acted in a partial and political manner at the behest of the central government. Similarly, it has been observed that whenever there is a change in the ruling party at the central level, there has been mass removal of the governors appointed by the previous governments. It is because of this reason the Punchi Committee on Center-State Relations had highlighted that there is growing politicization of the office of governor, because of which the independence and autonomy of the office of governor has got compromised. And this controversy related to office of governor has mainly arisen with respect to the exercise of discretionary powers by the governors under Article 163. So if you look at Article 163, it states that there shall be Council of Ministers headed by Chief Minister in order to aid and advise governor in exercise of his functions. However, Article 163 goes on to states that the governor can exercise his discretionary powers in certain exceptional circumstances. Now, if you look at the wording of Article 163, it clearly states that the discretionary powers of the governor can be exercised only in those cases where the governor is required to exercise his discretionary power either under the Indian Constitution or if it is required by the Indian Constitution. That means to say that the governor can exercise his discretionary powers only under compelling circumstances, and more importantly, such compelling circumstances should have arisen because of the provisions of the Indian Constitution. So if one looks at the spirit of Indian Constitution with respect to exercise of discretionary powers by the governor, it can be stated that the exercise of discretionary powers of the governor should be activated by good faith, it should be dictated by a reason, and more importantly, the governor has to exercise necessary caution with respect to exercise of discretionary powers. However, it is observed that the governors have acted in a partial and political manner with respect to exercise of their discretionary powers. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll first understand as to what are the discretionary powers of the governor, and more importantly, why these discretionary powers have proved to be controversial. Secondly, we look into certain reforms with respect to the appointment and removal of the governor as suggested by Sarkaria Committee as well as the Punchi Committee. Now coming to the discretionary powers of the governor. Now the Indian Constitution does not explicitly provide the list of discretionary powers of the governor. However, looking at the nature of functions performed by the office of governor, one can infer the discretionary powers exercised by him. For example, whenever the state legislature passes a bill, such a bill goes to the governor for his assent. So when a bill passed by the concerned state legislature goes to the governor, under his discretionary powers, the governor can either give his assent or withhold his assent to the bill. Similarly, under Article 200 of the Indian Constitution, when a bill is passed by the state legislature, the governor can even refer the bill for the approval of the president. On the similar lines, Article 164 of the Indian Constitution states that the chief minister of a state shall be appointed by the governor. However, in case of a hung assembly, that is to say, if no party wins a majority, then the governor can exercise his discretionary powers with respect to the appointment of chief minister. Similarly, the governor can also exercise his discretionary powers with respect to the dismissal of the government which has lost confidence of the state legislative assembly. However, such a government refuses to quit. Under such circumstances, the governor can exercise his discretionary powers to dismiss the government. Further, you all must be aware that under Article 356 of the Indian Constitution, the President's rule can be imposed in the states on account of the breakdown of constitutional machinery. And this President's rule can be imposed based upon a report submitted by the governor of a state. So these are some of the discretionary powers exercised by the governors in India. Now, the governor in India is required to exercise these discretionary powers in a neutral and an unpartisan manner. However, it has been observed that the governors have tended to use the discretionary powers for certain political gains. For example, with respect to appointment of chief minister, when there is a hung assembly, it has been observed that the governors have taken decision based upon political reasons. Similarly, the governors have also given a politically biased report for the imposition of the president's rule in the states. So, because of the exercise of discretionary powers by the governors in an arbitrary manner, the office of governor has proved to be controversial. So, in order to improve the working of the office of governor, there is a need to bring about reforms with respect to the appointment and removal of the governor. And these reforms have been suggested by both Sarkaria Committee as well as Punchi Committee. So before discussing the recommendations of Sarkari and Punchi Committee, let us understand the present mechanism for the appointment and removal of the governor. Now, with respect to appointment of the governor, it is dealt under Article 155 of the Indian Constitution, which states that the governor of a state shall be appointed by the president by warrant under his hand and seal, and the only qualifications laid down in the Constitution with respect to office of governors are that the governor should be citizen of India, and secondly, the governor should have completed the age of 35 years, which means to say there is no elaborate qualifications needed for the person to be appointed as the governor. Similarly, Article 156 of the Indian Constitution deals with the removal of the governor, wherein the Article 156 states that the governor shall hold office during the pleasure of the president. So, even though the Indian Constitution provides a tenure of 5 years for the office of governor, the governor can be removed at the will of the president. Now, this clearly shows that the office of governor in India do not enjoy the security of tenure. Because of this particular problem, the office of governor is undergoing politicization in India. So, to address these problems related to appointment and removal of the governor, the recommendations given by the Sarkari and Punchi Committee are: firstly, with respect to the appointment of the governor, both Sarkari and Punchi Committee have given a list of criteria to be chosen by the president for the appointment of governor. The first criteria here is that a person to be appointed as governor should be an eminent person in some walk of life. Secondly, such a person should be from outside the state. Thirdly, a person should be a detached figure and he should not be intimately connected with the local politics of the states. And lastly, a person to be appointed as a governor should not have taken part in the politics generally and particularly in the recent past. In this regard, both Sarkariya Committee as well as Punchi Committee were of a belief that if this particular criteria is chosen for the appointment of a person as a governor, then automatically we would be able to ensure the independence and autonomy of the office of governor. Similarly, with respect to removal of the governor, as we have discussed, the governor can be removed at the will of the president, which shows that the governor do not enjoy the security of tenure. Thus, in order to provide security of tenure to the office of governor and to prevent undue politicization of his office, the Punchi Committee has recommended that Article 156 of the Indian Constitution has to be amended, and through this particular amendment, the phrase "during the pleasure of the president" has to be deleted. Apart from that, as you all must be aware, Article 61 of the Indian Constitution provides for the impeachment of the president by the parliament. So the Punchi Committee has recommended that a similar provision for the impeachment of the governor by the state legislature has to be provided under Article 156. So with respect to removal of the governor, the Punchi Committee has suggested two major recommendations. The first recommendation is that the term "during the pleasure of the president" should have to be deleted from Article 156. Secondly, there is a need to provide for the impeachment of the office of governor on the lines of the impeachment of the president. Thirdly, it is commonly observed that when a person demits the office of governor, he or she in turn gets an appointment either under the state government or under the union government, or such a person may actually take up active politics. And it is because of these reasons some of the governors can act in a partial and non-neutral manner. So to address this particular problem, the Punchi Committee has suggested that the governor should not be eligible for any other appointment either under the union government or under the state government upon the end of their tenure. However, they should be eligible for the second term as governor, or they should be eligible for fighting elections for the office of either the vice president or the president of India. Similarly, Punchi committee has also recommended that upon the end of the tenure, the governor should not return to the active politics. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Based upon our discussion, an expected UPSC mains question from this particular article could be: the office of governor has turned controversial in the recent times, leading to the deterioration in the center-state relations. In this regard, examine the need for reforms with respect to the appointment and removal of the governor. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. Now the next article appears on page number 11. The title of the article is A Blow to the Disclosure Norms. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Important Aspects of Governance, Transparency and Accountability. As you all must be aware, recently the Supreme Court of India delivered a landmark judgment in order to bring the office of CJI under the ambit of RTI Act. Now this particular judgment of the Supreme Court is considered to be quite significant because it enhances the overall transparency and accountability of the higher judiciary, and it would also lead to a higher amount of public trust and confidence in the functioning of the judiciary. However, at the same time, the Supreme Court has also imposed a set of conditions or the test for the disclosure of information under the RTI Act. Now, one of the important tests laid down by the Supreme Court is with respect to the public interest test. The public interest test shall be applicable when an RTI application has been filed in order to know the personal information of the judges. Now, as per the public interest test, the personal information of the judges shall be disclosed only if the disclosure of such personal information outweighs the possible harm. Now, let us understand this particular aspect of the public interest test through two examples. Let's say a particular RTI application has been filed in order to know the medical records of a particular judge. Now, the medical records of a judge is purely a personal information, and the disclosure of such personal information may end up adversely affecting the fundamental right to privacy of the judge. And according to the public interest test, the disclosure of medical records shall not be allowed. On the other hand, let's say a particular RTI application has been filed in order to know the assets and liabilities of the judges. Now, even though the assets and liabilities of the judges are the personal information, however, the disclosure of this particular personal information would enhance the overall public trust and confidence in the functioning of the higher judiciary. Thus, the disclosure of assets and liabilities by the judges would enhance the public interest, and thus such an information has to be disclosed under the RTI Act. Now, with respect to public interest test, this particular article here has raised certain concerns, wherein the article highlights that the Supreme Court verdict may actually become a precedent in future for withholding certain information of the public authorities under the RTI Act. That means going forward, the central public information officers may use the excuse of the Supreme Court verdict in order to withhold the personal information of the public authorities. And this judgment of the Supreme Court is considered to be problematic because the Supreme Court judgment has fundamentally changed the character of the Right to Information Act. As per the judgment of the Supreme Court, this article argues that the overall scope of the disclosure of information has got reduced, whereas the set of restrictions on the flow of information has got widened. Similarly, going forward, the public authorities can use the Supreme Court verdict so as to deny the information under the RTI Act. Hence, as part of this video analysis, first and foremost, we'll understand as to what are the present set of restrictions on withholding information under the RTI Act. And secondly, we'll understand as to how these restrictions under the RTI Act have got widened through the Supreme Court judgment. Presently, the Section 8 of the RTI Act lays down various restrictions with respect to the disclosure of personal information. In other words, the Section 8 of the RTI Act basically comes out with a set of conditions on the basis of which the personal information can either be withheld or disclosed. Let us understand as to how does the section 8 of the RTI Act should ideally work through a flowchart. Now let's say a particular RTI application has been filed in order to know the personal information of a public authority. First and foremost, it is checked whether such kind of personal information is rated to the public activity. And if it is rated to public activity, automatically the personal information should have to be disclosed. On the other hand, if the personal information is not rated to public activity, then the second test is applied. Under the second test, it is sought to know whether the disclosure of personal information violates the right to privacy. So if the disclosure of personal information does not violate the right to privacy, then the personal information has to be disclosed under the RTI Act. On the other hand, if the disclosure of personal information violates the right to privacy, then the third test is applied. Under the third test, the question which is raised here is, does the disclosure of personal information serves a larger public interest? And if it serves the largest public interest, then automatically the personal information has to be disclosed. On the other hand, if the disclosure of personal information does not serve the larger public interest, it is only then the personal information can be withheld under the RTI Act. Now let us say a particular RTI application has been filed in order to know the educational qualifications of a public authority. Now, even though it is a personal information, however, the educational qualification of a public authority is indirectly linked to its public activity, and hence, accordingly, such an information has to be disclosed. On the other hand, let's say an RTI application has been filed in order to know the medical records of a public authority. Now, in this particular case, the medical records is not rated to its public activity. Then we apply the second test. The second test here would be, does the disclosure of medical records violate the right to privacy? So since it violates the right to privacy, then we would apply the third test. The third test here would be, does the disclosure of medical records serve the larger public interest? Now let us say a public authority in this particular case has availed a medical treatment, and the cost of such medical treatment has been in turn reimbursed by the government. Hence, the cost of the medical reimbursement incurred by the government should be known to all the people, and accordingly, such kind of medical records have to be disclosed under the RTI Act. Let us now understand as to how the recent verdict of the Supreme Court has widened the scope of restrictions on the disclosure of personal information. First and foremost, the author of this particular article raises concerns that the introduction of public interest doctrine by the Supreme Court would be made applicable even to the public authorities. Now, this is a problem because in the paragraph 59 of the Supreme Court verdict, the Supreme Court has come up with an indicative list of what actually constitutes the personal information. Now, according to Supreme Court, the assets and liabilities, the educational qualifications, the income tax returns, the medical records, the disciplinary proceedings, etc., all these constitute the personal information under the RTI Act. Further, the Supreme Court has also stated that this is just an indicative list and it is not an exhaustive list as to what exactly constitutes the personal information of the public authorities. In other words, the Supreme Court has failed to come up with an exhaustive list of what actually constitutes the personal information under the RTI Act. Hence, in this regard, the author of this particular article has raised concerns that this particular indicative list put forth by the Supreme Court may be in turn used by the public information officers so as to withhold the personal information under the RTI Act. Now, for example, if a particular RTI application has been filed in order to know the educational qualifications of a public authority, then automatically the public information officers may use the excuse of the Supreme Court judgment so as to withhold such kind of information. That is, the public authorities may simply fail to carry out these three tests that we have discussed earlier. So when an RTI application is filed in order to know the personal information, without carrying out these three tests, the public information officers can simply refuse to provide such information. Secondly, the author also highlights that some of the important aspects such as the assets and liabilities, income tax returns, medical records, etc. should not be treated as a personal information simply because this kind of personal information is more related to the public activity carried out by such public authorities. Now, apart from these concerns raised by the author with respect to the recent verdict of the Supreme Court, in our DNS dated 14th of November 2019, we had discussed various other issues related to Supreme Court judgment. Hence, I would suggest you to go through this particular DNS dated 14th of November 2019 in order to understand the various issues with respect to the recent Supreme Court judgment. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 10 in the form of a lead article. The title of the article is A Revival of Battles Already Fought and Lost. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance. Now, before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. As you all must be aware, Sabrimala is a Hindu shrine that is located in a state of Kerala. This particular shrine is dedicated to Lord Ayyappa, who is considered to be a celibate or a brahmachari. Accordingly, the board which manages the Sabrimala temple had put a ban on the entry of women of the menstruating age between 10 and 50 from entering the Sabrimala temple. Now, if you look at Article 26 of the Indian Constitution, this particular article provides a fundamental right to the various religious denominations such as the temple trust, Waqf board, etc. to manage their own religious affairs. Now, the board which manages the Sabrimala temple argued that it has a fundamental right to regulate its own religious affairs in accordance with Article 26. It also argued that the ban on entry of the women of the menstruating age into Sabrimala is an essential practice of the religion since Lord Ayyappa is a celibate. Because of which a number of petitions were filed before the Supreme Court challenging the ban on the entry of women into the Sabrimala temple. Accordingly, in the year 2018, the Supreme Court struck down the ban on entry of women into the Sabrimala temple. And this particular ban on the entry of women into the Sabrimala temple was struck down on basis of a number of grounds. First and foremost, the Supreme Court highlighted that the ban on entry of women into the Sabrimala temple violates Article 14 and Article 15. Secondly, the Supreme Court also ruled that restricting the women of the menstruating age from entering into the Sabrimala temple would amount to the practice of untouchability that has been prohibited under Article 17 of the Indian Constitution. Thirdly, the Supreme Court also highlighted that the ban on entry of women into the temple would violate their religious freedom as guaranteed under Article 25 of the Indian Constitution. Now, this particular judgment of the Supreme Court was considered to be significant on the number of grounds. First and foremost, this judgment highlighted the important role of the judiciary in bringing about the socio-religious reforms in the Indian society. It also highlighted as to how the judiciary can uphold the religious rights and prevent the discrimination that takes place in the name of religion. And the third significance of this particular judgment is that the Supreme Court stated that the ban on the entry of women into Sabrimala is not an essential part of the religion. Now, this becomes important because if you look at the arguments put forth by the board that manages the Sabrimala temple, it had mainly put forth two arguments so as to enforce the ban on the entry of women. First and foremost, it had highlighted that it had the fundamental right to regulate the religious affairs in accordance with Article 26 of the Indian Constitution. It had also argued that the ban on the entry of women into Sabrimala is an essential practice of the religion since Lord Ayyappa is a celibate or a brahmachari. So this particular judgment of the Supreme Court is considered to be significant from mainly two perspectives. First and foremost, the Supreme Court decided on certain religious questions on throwing open the temples, and secondly declared as to what constitutes the essential part of the religion and what does not constitute the essential part of the religion. Now, this particular judgment of the Supreme Court was in turn challenged by a number of petitions, and accordingly, recently, a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court has now decided to refer the earlier judgment to a larger bench constituting 7 judges. So, the questions before the 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court are, first and foremost, what should be the role of judiciary in deciding the religious questions? And secondly, should essential part of the religion be protected? Now, the author of this particular article has raised a number of concerns with respect to the Supreme Court undertaking a review of its earlier judgment. Let us look at these concerns one by one. First and foremost, the article highlights that the reviewing power of the Supreme Court is actually restricted under the Indian Constitution. Now, if you look at Article 137 of the Indian Constitution, under this particular article, the Supreme Court has been empowered to undertake a review of its earlier judgment. However, such review of its earlier judgment is in turn subjected to both parliamentary laws as well as the rules of procedure which have been laid down by the Supreme Court. Now, according to the rules of procedure laid down by the Supreme Court can review its earlier judgment only when the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court is likely to lead to the injustice. Now, with respect to Supreme Court judgment on the Sabarimala issue, the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court had prevented the injustice and the discrimination that was meted out to the women, and hence the article argues that there was no need to undertake the review of the earlier judgment. Secondly, ideally, before undertaking the review of its earlier judgment, the bench of the Supreme Court should have highlighted as to what were the errors in its previous judgment. However, the 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court decided to refer the earlier judgment to the larger bench without pointing out as to what were the errors in the previous judgment. Thirdly, one of the Supreme Court judges who had delivered the earlier Sabarimala verdict had pointed out that a smaller bench of the Supreme Court cannot pose questions before the larger bench of the Supreme Court. However, as stated before, the 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court has decided to pose 2 questions before a larger bench constituting the 7 judges. And hence, posing questions to a larger bench is not within the bench's authority. And the last and most important concern is that the review of the earlier judgment is in turn going to revive the debate on the individual freedom and the religious rights. Now, this becomes important because in its earlier judgment, the Supreme Court had intervened in certain religious questions, and it had also declared as to what constitutes the essential part and what does not constitute the essential part of the religion. Hence, the very fact that the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court is set to be reviewed, this will in turn revive the debate on the individual freedom and the religious rights. Now, based upon a video analysis, a mains question for your practice here could be: the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the Sabarimala case not only questions the merit of the earlier verdict, but also represents an overreach of the authority of the court. Elaborate. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. The next article appears on page number 10. The title of the article is Stubble Burning is not the only culprit. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Environment, under the subsection Environmental Pollution and Degradation. As you all must be aware, stubble burning has been cited as the most important cause for the increasing air pollution in the NCR region. However, this particular article argues that stubble burning is not the only culprit for the increasing air pollution in the NCR region. Apart from stubble burning, there are other important reasons for the increasing air pollution. In this regard, this particular article basically focuses on 2 aspects. First and foremost, it highlights that stubble burning cannot be the only culprit for the increasing air pollution, and secondly, it has also given certain suggestions to address the stubble burning issue. Let us look at these 2 aspects of the article one by one. Now, with respect to why stubble burning is not the only culprit for the increasing air pollution in the NCR region, first and foremost, the article highlights that if stubble burning was the only culprit for the increasing air pollution, then the wind speed and the wind direction had to remain constant. However, the wind speed and the wind direction changes frequently, because of which the air pollution caused due to the stubble burning does not reach the NCR region at all the times. It is only when the wind speed is quite higher and the direction is towards the NCR region, then the air pollution from the stubble burning would reach the NCR region. Secondly, the particulate matter which arises due to the stubble burning have to travel the longer distances from the Punjab and Haryana to the NCR region, and as they travel the longer distances, some of the particulate matter also gets settled on. Because of which, whatever particulate matter pollution that we see in the NCR region may not be caused only due to the stubble burning, it may also arise on other important sources. And these sources of particulate matter pollution could be related to the burning of biomass in Delhi, the coal-based industries, coal-based power plants, as well as the drastic increase in the number of vehicles in the NCR region. Hence, the article here argues that apart from the stubble burning, there are other important reasons as well for the increasing air pollution in the NCR region. Now, with respect to various suggestions in order to address the issue of the stubble burning, first and foremost, the article highlights that we need to reduce the production of paddy, particularly in Punjab and Haryana. For example, the Haryana government has recently come up with a scheme so as to incentivize the farmers to grow pulses and oilseeds and give up the cultivation of paddy. As part of this particular incentive scheme, the Haryana government is transferring money to the farmers to cultivate the pulses and oilseeds by providing various kind of inputs. It is also giving an assurance to the farmers that it would procure the pulses and oilseeds from the farmers. Similarly, as you all must be aware, the central government has launched Pradhan Mantri Annadata Sanrakshan Abhiyan so as to incentivize the farmers to grow pulses as well as oilseeds. As part of this particular program, the government is providing the price support to the farmers for the procurement of the pulses and the oilseeds. Hence, there is a need to implement the schemes such as the PM Asha scheme so as to promote the diversification of Indian agriculture predominantly in the regions such as Punjab and Haryana. Secondly, we need to promote the early sowing of paddy crop in Punjab and Haryana. Now, this becomes important because the issue of stubble burning has become serious in the recent years because the time gap between the harvesting of paddy crop and the sowing of the wheat crop. Now, this particular time gap is quite less and the farmers will be required to sow the wheat crop much before the winter sets in. Hence, because of a lesser time frame, the farmers resort to burning off the stubble of the paddy crop. Hence, the idea here is to promote the early sowing of paddy so that there is an adequate time gap between the harvest of the paddy crop and the sowing of the wheat crop, and the stubble as such can then be efficiently managed. It has been stated that an act of the Punjab government has actually led to the increase in the stubble burning, and this particular act has been known as Punjab Preservation of the Subsoil Water Act 2019. Now, some of the experts have highlighted that this particular act of the Punjab government has actually contributed to the increase in the stubble burning in the recent years. So, let us understand as to how this particular act has led to the increase in the stubble burning. Now, under this particular act, the farmers are forbidden from sowing paddy before May 10 and transplanting it to the fields before June 10. Now, such a time frame has been laid down under the Act because between May 10 and June 10, maximum amount of evapotranspiration takes place. And such kind of maximum evapotranspiration basically takes place because of the maximum heat which is prevailing in this particular region between May 10 and June 10. So, the overall idea behind this particular Act was to prevent the over-exploitation of the groundwater. Now, even though this particular Act has been able to prevent the over-exploitation of the groundwater, some of the experts have pointed out that this particular act has actually led to the increase in the stubble burning. This is because under this particular act, the sowing of the paddy has got delayed by almost around 15 to 20 days. And because of this particular delay in the sowing of the paddy crop, the time gap between the paddy harvest and the sowing of wheat has actually got reduced. Hence, because of the decrease in the time gap, the farmers are left with no other option other than to burn the paddy stubble. So, what is the solution to this particular problem then? Should we amend this particular act? Now, the various studies have estimated that this particular act of the Punjab government has undoubtedly prevented the over-exploitation of the groundwater, and hence an amendment to this particular act to promote the early sowing of the paddy may actually end up depleting the groundwater table. Hence, there is no need to bring any kind of amendments in order to promote the early sowing of paddy under this particular act. However, we have to realize that one of the main reasons for the over-exploitation of the groundwater in Punjab and Haryana is because of the power subsidies that is available to the farmers. Since the farmers are able to get the power 24/7, this in turn leads to the over-exploitation of the groundwater. Hence, going forward, we need to provide for the direct benefits transfer on the subsidies on power, and such kind of subsidies have to be given only to the small and marginal farmers and not to the larger farmers. The third solution is with respect to the distribution of the happy seeder machines. Now, the happy seeder machines are basically the tractor mounted machines that cuts and lifts the residue of the previous crop and sows a new crop. So by using the happy seeder machine, the paddy straw is partly cut, chopped and left on the field as a mulch. So by using the happy seeder, we would not only be able to avoid the stubble burning, but we would also be able to promote the soil fertility. However, the main challenge with respect to happy seeder machine is that these happy seeder machines may be used only for 10 to 15 days during a part of a year, particularly during the time gap between the harvesting of the paddy crop and the sowing of the wheat crop. So since the happy seeder machine is idle for most of the year, the farmers may be reluctant to buy the happy seeder machines on their own. In this regard, the Punjab government has already started providing the subsidies to the farmers for buying the happy seeder machines. Now, apart from such a subsidy scheme, we must also ensure that the small and marginal farmers are able to hire such machines on a rental basis from the custom hiring centers. That is, since the small and marginal farmers may not have adequate amount of capital to buy the happy seeder machines, we must enable the small and marginal farmers to hire such machines on a rental basis. Now, recently the central government has come up with a Uber-like app which enables the small and marginal farmers to hire the agricultural machinery on a rental basis. Now, this particular app is known as the Custom Hiring Centers Farm Machinery app. So, going forward, we need to promote this particular app for the benefit of the small and marginal farmers. Now, based upon a video analysis, a mains question for your practice here could be: the stubble burning has emerged as one of the most important reasons for the increasing air pollution in Delhi. In this regard, suggest certain policy measures to address the problem of stubble burning. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. Now the next article appears on page number 20. The title of the article is Global Warming Alters the Rainfall Pattern. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection Indian and World Geography. Now, this particular article highlights that the global warming and climate change has affected the Madden-Julian oscillation, and this is in turn going to alter the global rainfall pattern. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand as to what exactly is the Madden-Julian oscillation and how the global warming has affected the Madden-Julian oscillation. Now, the phenomena of the MGO oscillation was actually put forward by Ronald Madden and Paul Julian, and because of which the oscillation has been named after them. The Madden-Julian oscillation is actually a moving system of wind, cloud and pressure, and this particular oscillation circles around the equator. And since the MGO oscillation consists of the heavy clouds, it brings the rainfall to the area which is under the influence of the MGO oscillation. Usually, the MGO oscillation takes around 30 to 60 days in order to circle the equator, and some of the cases it can even take almost around 90 days to circle the equator. And please note that the MGO oscillation is found only in the tropical region between 30° north to 30° south. Now, as to how the MGO oscillation impacts the local weather. Now, as stated before, the MGO oscillation circles around the equator. So, as the MGO oscillation moves across the equator, whenever any area comes under the influence of MGO oscillation, such area would receive higher rainfall, whereas the other areas in the equatorial region would receive less amount of rainfall. Let us understand this through a simple example. Let's say the MGO oscillation has been formed over the Indian Ocean. So, because of this, the Indian subcontinent would receive the higher rainfall. More importantly, if the MGO oscillation gets formed during the monsoonal season, then the monsoonal rainfall would get strengthened. However, as the Indian subcontinent receives the higher rainfall, the other areas that are not under the influence of the MGO oscillation, these areas would receive lower amount of rainfall. Now, for instance, if the MGO oscillation is over the Indian Ocean, then the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean would receive less amount of rainfall. Let us now try to understand as to how the MGO oscillation actually works and how it impacts the local weather. Now let us consider some of the important places on the equator, that is Africa, Sri Lanka and Indonesia. And let's say that Sri Lanka has been under the influence of low pressure. On the other hand, both Africa as well as Indonesia are under the influence of the high pressure. Now because of the low pressure prevailing in Sri Lanka, there is a convergence of winds at Sri Lanka. So as the winds converge, the air gets uplifted into the atmosphere, and as the air gets uplifted, the air gets cooled down, leading to the formation of the heavy clouds over Sri Lanka. So this particular formation of heavy clouds over Sri Lanka would in turn lead to a higher amount of rainfall over Sri Lanka. However, at the atmospheric level, there would be a divergence of air towards both Africa as well as Indonesia. The air that gets diverged then undergoes subsidence at both Africa as well as Indonesia, and this particular subsidence of air in turn reinforces the high pressure area at both Africa as well as Indonesia. So because of the subsidence of air that takes place at Africa as well as Indonesia, dry conditions would prevail at both these regions. So what is happening in this particular case is there is a heavy rainfall in Sri Lanka because of the formation of heavy clouds in the atmosphere, whereas both Africa as well as Indonesia would experience dry conditions. Now, as stated before, the MGO oscillation keeps on circling around the equator. However, for a certain period of time, it stays at a particular place. Now, the time frame for which the MGO oscillation stays at a particular place is referred to as the residence time. Now, let's say in case of Sri Lanka, the residence time is 5 days. This essentially means that the MGO oscillation is active over Sri Lanka for a period of 5 days. And as the MGO oscillation circles around the equator, after the residence time of 5 days, the MGO oscillation would then shift to the other places. Now, as you can see in this second diagram here, now Sri Lanka would come under the influence of high pressure, whereas Indonesia would come under the influence of low pressure. On the other hand, Philippines would come under the influence of the high pressure. So because of low pressure prevailing over Indonesia, the Indonesia as such would experience heavy rainfall, whereas both Sri Lanka as well as Philippines would experience the dry conditions. Now the residence time over Indonesia may be around 5 days, and after 5 days, the MGO oscillation would then shift to the other place. And in the third case, low pressure area would be formed over Philippines, whereas Indonesia would have the high pressure area. And because of the low pressure prevailing over Philippines, Philippines would then experience heavy rainfall. Thus, as explained through this particular diagram, the MGO oscillation keeps on circling around the equator, and any place that comes under the influence of the MGO oscillation, such a place would experience a higher amount of rainfall. Now, as to how the MGO oscillation has got impacted due to the global warming and climate change. Now, because of the global warming, there has been increase in the temperature of land surface as well as the ocean water surface in the equator. And because of this particular change in the temperature, there has been an overall change in the residence time of the MGO oscillation across the different places. Which means in some of the places on the equator, the residence time of the MGO oscillation has increased, whereas in some other places, the residence time of the MGO oscillation has actually got reduced. Now, this particular residence time of the MGO oscillation is in turn linked to the amount of rainfall. Now, if the residence time of the MGO oscillation increases, this means that a particular area on the equator would receive higher amount of rainfall. On the other hand, if the residence time of the MGO oscillation reduces, then a particular area on the equator would receive less amount of rainfall. Now, with respect to Indian Ocean, earlier the residence time of the MGO oscillation was almost around 19 days. However, because of the global warming and climate change, the residence time of the MGO oscillation in the Indian Ocean has got reduced to around 15 days. That means going forward, because of the less residence time of the MGO oscillation, the Indian Ocean region would receive less amount of rainfall. Let us now take up the prelims question for your practice. Now on page number 15 of the Hindu newspaper, there is an article which highlights that the Union Cabinet has recently decided to extend the term of the 15th Finance Commission. Now usually when the Finance Commission submit their recommendations, the recommendations are usually applicable for a period of 5 years. Now the 15th Finance Commission was earlier required to submit recommendations, and these recommendations were applicable for a period ranging from 2020 to 2025. However, recently the Union Cabinet has now decided to extend the term of the 15th Finance Commission to 6 years, which means to say now the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission would be applicable for a period of 6 years, that is from 2020 to 2026. In this regard, let us now look at a prelims-based question related to the Finance Commission of India. Now the question here is, consider the following statements related to the Finance Commission of India. The first statement reads as, it is constituted by the President every 5 years or earlier. Now this particular statement is correct. The second statement reads as, the chairman of the Finance Commission is usually the retired judge of the Supreme Court. Now this particular statement here is wrong, because the chairman of the Finance Commission is usually a person who is an expert in the field of public affairs. And with respect to 15th Finance Commission, the chairman of 15th Finance Commission is Mr. N.K. Singh. The third statement reads as, the recommendations of the Finance Commission are always binding on the government. Now even this particular statement here is wrong. This is because the recommendations of the Finance Commission are not always binding on the government. However, a very healthy convention has been developed in case of India, where usually the recommendations of the Finance Commission are normally accepted by the government. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question shall be A, that is one only. Now on page number 20 of today's Hindu newspaper, it has been highlighted that a new snake species known as the Trachycium aptali has been found in Arunachal Pradesh. Now this particular new snake species has been found in a wildlife sanctuary known as the Tally Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, located in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Now based upon this particular understanding, let us now take up a prelims based question for your practice. The question here is, which of the following wildlife sanctuaries are located in the state of Arunachal Pradesh? The options which are given here are Tally Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Pakoi Wildlife Sanctuary and the Dibang Wildlife Sanctuary. And the correct answer to this particular question here is answer D, that is all of these three wildlife sanctuaries are located in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.